All right, let's take a look at problem 27, which deals with overhead variances. Fun Inc. has a fully automated production facility in which almost 90% of overhead costs are driven by machine hours. As the company's cost accountant, you have computed the following overhead variances for May. So we've got $34,000 of favorable variable overhead spending variance. We've got $41,200 of favorable variable overhead efficiency variance. We're unfavorable on the fixed overhead amounts, though. We're unfavorable $28,000 for spending and $20,000 unfavorable for fixed overhead volume. Okay, now the company's president is concerned about the variance amounts, and he's asked you to show, how the variances were computed and to answer several questions. A couple more pieces of information here. Budgeted fixed overhead for the month is $1 million. The predetermined variable and fixed overhead rates are $20 and $40 per machine hour, respectively, and budgeted capacity is 20,000 units. So part A, let's tackle that first. Using the four-variance approach, prepare an overhead analysis in as much detail as possible. Okay, now I've placed the answer on the bottom part of the screen, and let me walk you through how we actually work with this. We start off with fixed overhead. We know that $1 million was the budgeted fixed overhead amount. And if we divide that by $40, which was the overhead rate per machine hour, we know that 25,000 hours were the budgeted number of hours, right? 1 million divided by 40 would give us 25,000. So that gives us our budgeted fixed overhead amount. We also know that the fixed overhead spending variance was 28,000, given right there. So if we know the budgeted fixed overhead was $1 million and we were 28,000 unfavorable, we add the 1 million to the 28,000 to come up with 1,028,000. See how that works? Okay, now once we know that, we also know we were 20,000 unfavorable for volume, so we know that 1 million plus 20,000 is more than what would appear under applied fixed overhead, which is 980,000. Once we have the 980,000, we divide by the $40, and we can calculate 24,500 of fixed overhead hours. Okay? And that's how we take care of how the fixed overhead spending and volume relate to a total fixed overhead variance of $48,000. Okay, next let's talk for a moment about the variable overhead amounts. Okay, so standard hours are moved to variable overhead, and they're multiplied by the variable rate of $20, right? So if we know we had 41,200 favorable, and what else do we know? I want to step back a minute here. In the last one, let me put that back on the screen here. Let me slide this over here so you can see it. All right, we were able to calculate that 980,000, right, divided by 40 gave us 24,500 of the actual hours applied. So once we need that number because we need that number to use here. We know that 24,500 was the hours applied, so we take the hours applied times 20, and the $20 is given. Let me slide this off now. Right there, $20 was how we apply it for variable overhead. So when we multiply the 20 times the 24,500 hours that we already calculated, we come up with 490,000 as the dollar amount of applied variable overhead. And then we simply add the variances. 490 plus 41,200 favorable means that, or actually subtract because this number needs to be less than this number. We come up with 448,800 hours. Dollars, excuse me. Meant to say dollars, not hours. Take the $448,800 and divide it by the variable overhead rate of 20, and we're able to compute the actual hours, so we can fill that in. Then we had 34,000 of favorable variances, so again, 448,800 minus 34,000, and we're able to come up with what variable overhead was. Okay? And then add those together, we come up with a total favorable overhead variance of 75,200, and you see we've tackled part A. Okay, now I've rearranged the screen so that we have that information that we solved on part A in front of us, and then we need to answer some other things. Part B says, calculate the standard machine hours, or, I'm sorry, let me say that correctly. On part B, they've asked us to come up with the standard number of machine hours allowed for each unit of output. And we can calculate that as $1.25 by taking the 25,000 budgeted machine hours and divide it by the 20,000 budgeted units. Okay? That's B. C says how many actual hours were worked in May. And we calculated that here, 22,440. D says, asks, what is the total spending variance? Well, the total spending variance would be the 28,000 unfavorable variance plus the 34,000 favorable variance. This one is for fixed overhead, this is for variable, and we come up with 6,000 favorable. All right, let me slide up a little bit, see if we can get all of E on here. Well, I guess we can get all of E on here. E says, what additional information about the manufacturing overhead variances is gained by inserting detailed computation into the variable and fixed manufacturing overhead analysis? And what we learned from this, and it says right here, is that we had favorable efficiency variance resulting from using 2,060 fewer machine hours than allowed, given a production level of 20,000 units. Okay, the fixed overhead volume variance resulted from underutilized capacity by 500 machine hours, and that's what we would expect. If we had underutilized capacity, we would expect to see an unfavorable fixed overhead variance. Okay, now I've slid up the solution a little bit so we can answer part F, which said, how would the overhead variances be closed if we use the three variance approach? Well, now you see the entry down here, right? You need to close out the variances, and you close them out to cost of goods sold. That's the typical approach used when standard costing is used. So we take our unfavorable variances that would all have, or we're using the three-part here. So we've got the 6,000 of spending variance, and we would close that out. Those were all unfavorable. With a debit. The variable overhead, which was all favorable, we don't see it, we would reverse that out with a 41,200 debit as well. The volume variance, which is unfavorable, we would credit it to reverse it out, and then the difference between those three shows up in cost of goods sold. And that's this problem, everyone.